Just in time for the holidays, Microsoft filed its rebuttal to the FTC. Who doesn't love a little holiday cheer on set from where everything gets wrapped in my house? And if you're not watching this during the holiday season, well, it's probably a little awkward because whatever. We're all in the get up because Microsoft at the very last hour on a Thursday night right before the holidays and everybody shut down for Christmas Eve and everything else, Microsoft filed its rebuttal, its 37-page rebuttal about its response to the FTC's complaint that, hey, you shouldn't be able to buy Activision, Blizzard, and all that good stuff. And Microsoft, they took actually a little bit different approach this time. In previous rebuttals and everything else in the EU and the UK, it's all been about Call of Duty. And this time, Microsoft, they flipped the script a little bit. So let's just dive into what Microsoft filed late last night. So kicking things off here, in the introduction, and the reason why I point this out is dang near the top, just like the very beginning, Microsoft is coming out and not taking the Call of Duty approach. They are pivoting hard, especially in this scenario, to mobile. They come out and say Xbox has next to no presence in mobile gaming, the fastest growing segment of gaming, in the place where 94% of gamers spend their time today. And Xbox and responded Activision Blizzard, also known as Activision, are just two of hundreds of game publishers who basically are competing with various different types of games and platforms with prices ranging all the way down to zero. Now, Microsoft goes on to point out, they say Xbox wants a piece of this mobile game industry where Microsoft currently states that 3/4, so 75% of Activision's gamers are on mobile and 1/3 of its revenue is on mobile as well. Basically, Microsoft's trying to chalk up the fact that Activision's, they've got some mobile chops where Microsoft has next to none. And actually the figure of 3/4 of Activision gamers are on mobile is really super interesting because we all think of Call of Duty, and this is intentionally Microsoft's point, as Call of Duty is where everybody in the Activision universe plays, and as here's Microsoft pointing out, actually from a pure headcount perspective, not the case. So Microsoft is really truly playing up the mobile segment. Now, the other interesting thing, well, there's several interesting things in here, but Microsoft came in with a chart, and I love charts, and who doesn't love a chart? And so Microsoft, once again, is really trying to show off here how small they actually are in the gaming console world on a percentage basis. So they came out with these charts according to their data, which is probably, at least from their own perspective, more accurate than what we see from third-party analyst firms. So we can look in the top left and we see shares of Sony, Nintendo, and Xbox consoles sold in 2021. Now, we all know the Switch has been pretty significantly outselling everything else, and while pundits like myself, or whatever the heck you want to call me, YouTuber personality, have always said, hey, Nintendo's kind of off on its own. The reason why we say that is because it just sells to a different category at a much higher volume than we see traditional Xbox Series consoles or PlayStation 4/5s. And you can really just see the facts here when you lay it out that Microsoft really is being trounced by consoles, which this is part of Microsoft's argument. They're saying, like, look, Nintendo Switch is part of the console segment, while Sony will kind of argues, no, they're really not. They're more of that independent entity. They're different. They're just serving a different market. But Microsoft's saying, look, they're a console. Consoles are consoles. Consoles is what they're arguing up on stage. And so here we are with, the numbers just kind of speak for themselves. And then the exclusive titles in 2021, and let's not even talk about 2022, because, look, Nintendo and Sony cleaned up. Microsoft had its small fair share. And then even on the mobile side, of course, that it is just basically a rounding error down to zero. So the charts, they don't play well for Microsoft. Of course, naturally, Microsoft's not going to put charts in there that says, look, we are dominating, and that's why we need Activision to keep our domination alive. That is the exact opposite intent of what Microsoft is trying to do. Now, moving on here, there's still a lot to kind of digest here. And this is where Microsoft starts to get a little bit pokey. While their introductory and everything else was kind of, I don't want to say soft-handed, but Microsoft definitely wasn't coming out taking an approach like, hey, FTC, you're kind of dumb. Like, they don't want to do that because Microsoft needs the FTC to approve this transaction and other transactions more than likely in the future related to gaming and non-gaming, so they can't just come out and just make them look like they're eating paste. So Microsoft came back and said this is one of their more stronger statements, and this is relation to the noise that generated almost immediately after the FTC complaint came out, where they said, hey, Microsoft, you didn't uphold your bargain to ZeniMax in the EU. And Microsoft and honestly the EU Commission came out and said, well, that's not true. And so Microsoft was putting in writing, and they say any suggestion that Microsoft's statement to the European Commission about the ZeniMax were misleading is incorrect. Microsoft explicitly said it would honor Sony's existing exclusivity rights and approach exclusivity for future titles on a case-by-case basis, effectively, which is exactly what has been done. The European Commission agrees it was not misled, stating publicly that the day after the complaint that Microsoft did not make any commitments to the European Commission, nor did the European Commission rely on any statements made by Microsoft about its future distribution strategy concerning ZeniMax games. Instead, the European Commission cleared the transaction unconditionally, as it concluded that the transaction would not raise any competition concerns. Now, as you can see, I've chosen red and green color here. I've just mixed up the color palette for whatever reason. So Microsoft is very clearly in that statement taking the stance that they are not in breach of any sort of conversations, agreements, or terms as part of that ZeniMax deal. That's a very big deal, because that was one of the pillars of the FTC's complaint, was that Microsoft did breach that contract despite the fact that they didn't. So here we are, Microsoft coming out and just saying, look, we're on the up and up, and that this is a vertical merger, and typically in the courts, vertical mergers are accepted because they're not harming competition. And Microsoft reiterates several times throughout its complaint that, hey, you're not here to protect Sony, and that's how it kind of feels. They don't use those exact terms, but you can read the justification and their arguments like, look, the FTC isn't here to protect Sony. They're here to protect the consumer, and in this scenario, the consumer will win because by coming into Game Pass, coming onto Switch, and lowering prices, especially if you use the Game Pass model, it's the consumer comes out ahead. And then finally, on Microsoft's argument palette, if you will, they come out for the millionth, the billionth, and the trillionth time and state, hey, look, there's no intent from Microsoft, despite the fact that we've given you millions of documents and everything you have asked for, to pull Call of Duty away from PlayStation. They go on to acknowledge that Nintendo has accepted the fact that they are going to be taking the 10-year deal to get Call of Duty onto whatever product they have in the pipeline. Everyone assumes a Switch, but I think it's probably Switch Next or somewhere along the Nintendo pipeline. It will have a version of Call of Duty, and Microsoft, despite everything they've done to try to get Sony on board, they can sit there and just say, nope, we're not. Sony doesn't want to come to the table and try to make this deal. So again, it's peppered throughout. FTC is not here to protect Sony. They're here to protect the consumer. And so this is Microsoft's counter argument back. Now the next steps, I believe it's going to go to the courts or the FTC. I don't know if they get a rebuttal in this as well, or potentially they can come to the table, the FTC and Microsoft, and try to hash this out. But either way, Microsoft now has officially filed its complaint and taking that slightly different approach, really hammering in on the mobile segment, trying to pull Call of Duty out. And they do that by saying, look how much bigger mobile is, at least from a player count base, than the traditional console. And they show how small their console market is anyways. And so it's just a slightly different tactic that we have seen Microsoft take over the previous iterations of the UK and the EU and everything else. And again, we are far from seeing this complete. As much as I love talking about FTC and all these rebuttals and the same narratives that keep popping up over and over again, it'll be nice when we get conclusion one way or another. I still believe that Microsoft, based on how the FTC is approaching this, and if you go read sites like Foss Patents, which I will link down below along with this court case, they really tend to believe that Microsoft actually has the winning argument here, and that some of this just feels like more of a formality, that you can't just let big juggernaut Microsoft come make a $70 billion transaction and just let them walk through, and something has to be done so that the government can say they did their part. And this kind of just continues to feel like that. So there we go. That is Microsoft's complaint wrapped up in a nutshell. You can go read the full thing. There's a ton more down below their argument where they specifically call out line items saying, like, we agree with this. We absolutely do not agree with this. This is false. Those sorts of things common in rebuttals in this sort of thing. So as always, if you want to stay updated on everything happening in the world of Microsoft, Xbox, and this FTC stuff, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.